first quotation from section 85 of the Investigations, he says, "A rule stands there like a signpost." That's a very useful phrase, and it recurs throughout the Investigations. There's many references back to this metaphor of the signpost. Sections 87 all the way through into the 400s and 500s. So it's useful to sort of have this motif of the signpost under control. A rule stands there like a signpost. It's connected to a theme in the Investigations in which the interlocutor says things like, "But the sign itself is dead." A signpost in itself is just a physical object, like any other. There isn't, in principle, any contradiction in the idea that a signpost with this shape means go that way. There isn't anything about a physical signpost on this picture of meaning. Remember, we were talking about a gap of something that simply belongs to nature on the one side of the gap, and the other side of the gap there's something that we think of as mental or intentional. If we think of the signpost as just part of the material world, then there isn't anything that belongs to it that has meaning built into it. And certainly if you take the signpost apart, and use a microscope and break it into little pieces, you won't find its meaning anywhere inside. It's not in that sense a physical property of the signpost. So with the idea within this picture that a signpost just stands there, is this just this physical object? And with the idea the signpost just stands there, you might think, what is an understanding? What is it to understand that? In order to stay on the pink path, I go this way. Well, the very natural thing to think is, that understanding, it involves two stages. First there's the stage of, as it were, taking in the physical sign. That itself stands there. Then there has to be a second stage. A natural word we might use here, without having gotten very elaborate in our theory about what the second stage involves, is the word interpretation. It's only the sign, qua physical entity, combined with an interpretation that yields an understanding of what we are to do in the light of it. Go this way. So we know to interpret the sign means to follow the arrow this way. There might be another culture in which you have things that look just like this, but if you understand the culture, you go this way. A good example of this was, came home to me when I was in Scotland a couple of days ago. First morning in the hotel. Hotel was on a big main street. I stepped out and almost got killed. Because I, of course, looked the way I thought you're supposed to. There's a line in the middle of the road. My understanding of these arrangements at some deep, unreflective, visceral level is people are driving on the right side and this thing like this and there's a crosswalk. That means you look a certain direction to see if a car's coming. In England, everything's set up exactly the same way, except you look in the opposite direction, or you die, or in my case, almost die, your first morning before you realize. Looks the same, only you do everything backwards. So a rule, similarly, to say a rule stands there like a signpost, is to say, I can give you a rule, but any rule I give you, it's the beginning of the problem now, apparently is in no better situation than the signpost itself. This is within the frame of this problem. So say, I tell you, whenever you see a pink sign with a pointing arrow like that, that means go this way. Go in the direction of the pointing arrow. I could write that out. It's a whole lot of words. But now you've got to understand the rule. Any rule comes in the form of a rule formulation. If it's true that any act of understanding involves the object understood as some sort of shapes or sounds or marks or noises in the world, plus an interpretation, then similarly it looks like one ought to have to say or be able to say about our rule. Well, that too is something that's been formulated, but it too could be interpreted in more than one way. So it too must be first interpreted before it itself can guide an interpretation of the signpost. So the rule itself, qua object to be understood, stands there like a signpost. Now, one thing you might want to say at this point, I don't have this in the quotations, an idea that Wittgenstein explores quite a bit. It's connected with what some people call Platonism in philosophy of meaning or philosophy of mathematics. One thing you might say is, well, there's some rules which, if you state them, people just understand them. Boom. Those rules, somehow, when you state those, there's no problem anymore about misinterpretation. They're just somehow transparent or self-intimating. But one question you might have is, if that's true, why do we wait a while to introduce that idea? Why don't we just somehow say, we could do that already here with the signpost? And how does it work? How do signposts just tell us what they mean? You can see how we have a version here of what McDowell called the myth of the given, or a potential version of what McDowell here called the myth of the given. Not in philosophy of perception now, whereas a mere causal event that was supposed to have sufficient rational structure to be able to justify. That was with respect to how it is that experiences could have content. But here it's a physical entity, which somehow, my merely taking in, is supposed to justify one interpretation rather than another. But in both cases, it can look like you're trying to build into something, which itself, a mere moment or element or transaction in nature, a normative ground for a certain kind of meaning or justification or reason, which it itself cannot deliver. Hence, myth of the given. One wants something to immediately be given. In this case, an object to be interpreted and its interpretation, which itself is not the kind of thing that can be given, or hence that would be the worry on the mythical conception of the given. This is supposed to be, as we'll see in a moment, absolutely general. It doesn't matter what rules we're talking about. The point is, if you get into the problem thinking a certain way, it's going to affect all rules, not just some rules. Any rule that involves understanding, any rule that involves correctness or incorrectness, and that's all rules. The question is, isn't it going to be a problem about that? We'll see this more clearly as we go on. Yes, does the signpost leave no doubt open about the way I have to go? Does the signpost itself somehow make clear which way I have to go? And it's very tempting to say here, no, the signpost itself can't do that. Does it show which direction I am to take when I have passed it? Whether along the road or the footpath or cross country? Does the signpost itself show which direction I am supposed to take? Now you could answer yes or no. If you answer yes, and you're in the grip of this worry, then the question arises, but where is it said which way I am to follow it? Where does the signpost say, go this way rather than go that way? That seems to be, on this understanding, something more than the signpost. That's an understanding, an interpretation of what the signpost means. And if there were not a single signpost, but a chain of adjacent ones, or of chalk marks on the ground, is there only one way of interpreting? So once we get into this problem, we think the signpost itself is dead. It doesn't mean anything. It's only signpost plus interpretation that yields an understanding of what we are to do, such that it could be correct or incorrect. Then, once we have that picture, it's very hard to see what you're going to add that helps. Say you point. Which way do I go here? But your pointing gesture stands there like a signpost. But now, in virtue of what do I know that I'm supposed to go this way rather than that way? That seems to require a interpretation of the pointing gesture. We'll say, well, okay, let's make it absolutely clear. Let's put up several signposts. This one explains that one. This one makes it clear that what this one means is this. We could add these. This clearly isn't going to help if you have a problem here. Multiplying signposts is going to be very helpful. Well, we might try, let's put some arrows in the ground. Nice magic marker. I could draw pink arrows all the way. leave out no bits, pink arrows at every step. We still have the same problem. And this passage then goes into an issue of doubt. If you've raised a doubt about whether this is meant rather than that, and you take the doubt to arise in the way I've just described, then how are you going to close off the doubt? So put this way so far, this is just something I want to alert you to, we've got something that has, at least initially, the form of a Cartesian problem. How do I know what is meant? I'm trying to find my way. I take it there is such a thing as a signpost meaning something. But I want to know which way to go. And the skeptical worry, notice, is based on a kind of indistinguishability argument. There could be a tribe in which things looks just like this. There could be a country called England in which the roads, were divided just down the middle and the cars look the same. But everybody does everything in the opposite direction or on the opposite side. So how can I tell? How can I be sure? And again, here, with this Cartesian doubt, as with the other one, they're not denying that probably I should go that way or something like that. The issue isn't, if we're betting money, what would be a good idea? The issue is, in virtue of what does my knowledge consist? How could I know that? Well, it doesn't look like I can know it, except through an interpretation. And then it looks like an argument can come up, which is exactly the same argument we had in the Cartesian case, about perceptions in principle being misleading, but indistinguishable from veridical ones. I could have an interpretation that seems for all the world invited, but it is possible that it's a misinterpretation. If I can't exclude the possibility of misinterpretation, then how could I ever know what the sign means? I might get lucky and follow it out, and it turns out I'm there. More than lucky. But how, in what sense did I know? What would it mean for me to know it? That's a Cartesian issue. But quickly in the investigations, this turns into a worry of a deeper sort. So now, here we had signposts. But the point is not just about signposts, but signs generally. That is, things we take ourselves to be able to understand. Things in the light of which there is a correct and incorrect way of going on, in using the sign again and in acting in accordance with our understanding of the sign. So another simple example is proper names. Maybe the simplest kinds of words. Moses. There's the word Moses. It names somebody. How do I know who it names? Well, I could give an explanation of who Moses names. Quotation 2, 87 investigations. I take Moses to mean the man, if there was such a man, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, whatever he was called then, and whatever he may or may not have done besides. He chooses the example of Moses. It's a good example to choose to get this worry going. It's not absolutely clear he existed. It's not absolutely clear the text is completely reliable. And you might think, well, there is somebody who was born to Pharaoh, who was very important to help the Israelites. But he didn't lead them out of Egypt. Maybe there was somebody who brought some commandments down, but didn't lead them out. Maybe he led them out of Egypt, but there weren't any commandments. You could really start getting worried, especially if you're not some kind of Christian or Jew, that God actually spoke to him through the burning bush. There's a lot of things that happened to Moses. There seems to be somebody we're talking about. Which descriptions, if you think the meaning of a name depends upon some of these descriptions being true, which descriptions are the ones you mean when you say Moses? Somebody says, well, he wasn't actually a son. He wasn't actually put in a boat on a river. I won't conclude, Moses didn't exist. I'll conclude, well, that's not, what I mean by Moses isn't someone who's put in a river. I mean this other guy, who led people out of Egypt, who I thought was also put on a boat. But his not being put in a boat doesn't keep me from meaning something by Moses. But similar doubts to those about Moses are possible about the words in the explanation. So I say, he's the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. What do you mean by Israelites? What do you mean by Egypt? Well, by Egypt I mean a country that has these and these borders. Well, actually, it looks like they start over here. That wasn't Egypt according to you. Well, back then they called it. So by Egypt you mean what people called Egypt back then? Or what we call Egypt now? we can go on. But any explanation you give of what you mean by the word depends upon your understanding of the words you use in your explanation of what you mean by the word. Those two have to be interpreted. They can be misinterpreted. There can be more than one way of going on from what seems like what you meant to other cases once complicated factors come up, like the lines have changed or no one was ever put in a boat. Nor would these questions come to an end when we got down to words like red, dark, sweet. But then how does an explanation help me to understand if after all it is not the final one? If for any explanation you can give about what you mean by your words, a question can, at least in principle, always arise. You can always think of a situation in which a question will arise about what you mean by one of the words in the explanation, what you mean by the original word. In that case, the explanation is never completed. So, it's never the final one. A further misinterpretation can always arise. And then he says, at the end of our quotation, in that case, the explanation is never completed. So I still don't understand what he means, and never shall. As though an explanation, as it were, hung in the air, unless supported by another one. Notice what's happening in the worry here. Initially, it looks like, well, we can't be sure what we mean, because our explanations could be wrong. But if what it is to understand what we mean is to know our interpretation is right, and the only way to know our interpretation is right is to at least be able to understand what a formulation of the interpretation expresses, and that itself is something that could be misunderstood. If we start to think this through, there's a worry about what it is we even think understanding consists in. If we think what understanding consists in is understanding this in the light of that, where understanding that thing itself raises the same problem, it looks like we're creating a situation in which it looks like our understanding is always incomplete. Our grounds for a belief that we know what something means aren't insufficient, but nothing could count as there being sufficient. So an initial Cartesian worry is, how do we know when someone says this, that he meant this rather than that? But the deeper Kantian worry comes. We start to focus on the fact that, my God, all of those performances, all of those acts themselves, which in a sense are ultimately just physical marks, are consistent with my understanding of what the rule that stands there like a signpost means, and his understanding of what the rule that stands there like a signpost means. And if you think about it carefully, you'll realize we're not going to solve this problem now by going on further. No matter how long we go on, there's more than one function, different functions, that all of those instances could be correct in the light of an understanding of, and yet what would be the next step would be different. What does it mean to say that he's grasped this? If no number of instances show that he's grasped this is correct, what is it to grasp this is correct? What is correctness mean? If up to any point there's an infinite number of things we could mean that would be correct, and we can't tell from the instances themselves which of them we do mean. What does acting correctly in the light of the understanding mean? That's the question that's starting to float up here.